Hello there everybody, Brandon here coming to you again from my gallery and studio today. So a little quick background on myself. I just started painting about 3 years ago, so I have not been doing this for a very long time, relatively speaking. And so it took my parents by surprise that first Christmas when I gave them a few paintings that I had done, because up to that point I had not done anything artistic at all in my whole life. So they had a painting, well, I call it a painting, it's some kind of pre-manufactured picture here, I think, hanging in their living room for a number of years that they want me to redo now, since I'm dabbling in this whole art thing myself. So I'm going to be painting over an existing piece here to create one of my own. So this painting back here is the one that I'm going to be working on. Now this particular piece is on some kind of panel. It's not on any kind of canvas there. There's no signatures anywhere on this thing, so I don't know if there's an actual artist involved here that had done this piece of work originally or not. I think this piece here is some kind of prefab thing that came out of one of those home decor type stores. So at any rate, I'm going to transition it into a piece that's going to have a mountain stream in there instead of this kind of sidewalk area. And I'm going to keep the autumn kind of fall foliage theme going on there, because the colors is what they liked to begin with on this painting while they bought it. So we're going to stick with that theme for the colors of the trees, but we're just going to turn it into more of a mountain scene with a river in there. So let's have a look at my process for getting that done. So my first step here in transforming this painting was to just come in with some dark green, brown, and black mix here. So some raw umber, some sap green, some black. Cover up this whole bottom section that I'm ultimately going to be turning into a mountain stream and river. So the area here where my river is going to be in, I'm putting in more horizontal brush strokes, and I'm introducing a tiny bit of titanium white into there to lighten that mix up a little bit in that area. The rest of this is going to be rhododendrons and some background foliage, so putting in this dark green mix, and then as I move to the stuff that's going to be further away back there, again introducing a little bit more titanium white to lighten that mix up a little bit in the distance. Basically I'm using a big 2-inch flat brush here to cover a lot of ground, and just turning the brush to create different textures here. I wanted to introduce a little bit more atmosphere in these large trees at the top as well, so I mixed in some titanium white with some red and orange mixes to basically block in some color up there as well, and then I'll come back in with some darker stuff later on in the process here. Again, just wanted to create a little bit more atmosphere, a little bit more depth going on with some of that. Putting a little bit more of that same mix here into these background trees as well, a little bit more titanium white in with some oranges and reds to create a little bit more distance. And then I'm just filling in some colors along the edges of where my rhododendrons are going to be here to create the river banks, and to get a little bit of the start of my water reflections going, mixing in some of my tree colors here with some reds and some oranges and putting that in as well. To finish up these larger trees at the top now, it is mostly going in with some darker yellow ochre with a touch of raw umber mix here, and then some red on this side as I move into the darker background colors of these leaves. I'm trying to go with a little bit of the backlit look, as if the sun is on the opposite side of these trees, shining through in some places. Now off in the distance here, I've moved to a smaller 1/2-inch brush that I'm putting in leaf details and textures off in the distance with, just basically a mix of pinks and oranges back there with some titanium white to give that distance, laying also in some tree trunks in the distance with a mix of gray, brown, some titanium white in there to give off that illusion of distance. Putting in small details here on the background now with the smaller brush, just touching in some green combinations to put in the distant background of these rhododendrons. I do have another video up on the YouTube channel that's more of a inclusive look at how I'm doing those background rhododendrons. So if you want to check that video out, it's up on the channel as well. And now I'm moving into my final bit of detailing out of these large trees here with the fall colors on them. So I have a 1/2-inch wash brush here that I'm just using the corner of and touching in highlight colors here of the brighter oranges and reds, covering up some of that previously put in background atmosphere color and over the top of my darker stuff to put the highlights in. Now I'm starting to work on these distant rhododendrons, so I laid in a little bit of a darker color along the base of them to give me that shadow that's back there. And now I'm coming back in with a darker green background color that I'm laying in with putting just different shapes with changing the angle of my brush. I move over here to this first larger tree trunk highlight. I'm just putting in some lighter highlights of bark texture there. And now I'm moving back into finishing up my background rhododendrons here. Also, since I have that color on the brush, I started to lay in some of the reflections onto the water as well. The process of the background rhododendrons here obviously is just laying in some small leaf texture highlights in the distance. I've started to use a small 5-aught spotter brush to do that, varying up my values of greens in this background here with darks and lights just to create different values from one bush to another, so it's not a monotone green or yellow look back there. Everything's got a little bit different appearance to it, so it creates a more realistic look when it's done. Each time I went back to the palette here with the spotter brush, I was just mixing in different amounts of a sap green and a yellow ochre, maybe adding a little titanium white in from time to time just to give me the different values of the green that I'm putting in back here to keep the variety so it looks more realistic. Lastly, I'm using a liner brush here with a little gray mix of black, titanium white, a little bit of brown in there to create some distant little tree limbs that's coming out of these rhododendrons. Now I move into the foreground rhododendrons here, where I've picked up a little 1/8-inch angled brush to create larger leaf textures in the foreground because it's closer to me. So again, I'm still varying my mixes here of a sap green and a yellow ochre and a little titanium white in some of it as well, to create different values of the green, brighter highlights in some areas, darker in others, just to keep the variation going throughout each bush here so it's not all the same. As I move further away from me, I just make my brush strokes and marks a little smaller, so the appearance of these leaves going away from you, I can achieve that with the smaller brush strokes. And then again, finally adding in a few limb textures here with the liner brush and extending a few limbs out above the water itself, and then in some of my gaps between the leaves. Moving to the opposite side of the canvas here is the same process on some foreground rhododendron leaves, so larger brush stroke marks up front closer to the front foreground, and then just varying it as I move backwards. Now moving into doing the water here, finally I wanted to create a little bit of a drop off in my water here, a little bit of a small waterfall area, so I'm putting in the darker area there to indicate that, and then I'll start to bring in the highlights of the water across the top. And then this is a process of going back and forth with darks and lights again to create some reflections here. Back off in the distance, I'm putting a little bit brighter white highlights off in the distance, just to show where it's reflecting a little more atmosphere back there. And then adding in a couple of rocks here to the right edge, a dark background color with some black and brown in there, some highlights on top of it with some titanium white, a little bit of yellow ochre, a touch of red on the highlight here as well, and the rocks. And then the water process is just varying up my colors here, putting in a lot of atmosphere colors of blue and white in here and some grays in there to highlight out some of the reflections, along with some of the greens and reds and oranges from the foliage of the trees. Bringing in a little brighter white highlights here onto these small little waterfalls and drop-offs as the water is running across these rocks. Creating a small splash effects here with a little bit more titanium white, and then moving in some little extra white here as there's some current as this stream moves over to the left, so I'm putting a little extra highlight over there as well. I've now moved to the liner brush to put in kind of the final touches of these water highlights, the brightest little white highlights in these small little waterfall drop-offs, the brightest highlights in the little splashy areas, and then as well as some of the edges of where you're seeing reflections of the sky atmosphere versus reflections of the tree foliage, just moving back and forth and putting some of those details in along the edges with the liner brush. The last thing I do here is put the rock highlights on where this water's spilling over. Basically just highlights with brown and red and a little bit of titanium white, and then I'm done. Alright, there is our completed transformation of this piece. Now we've got a nice little river scene running through there. Hope you guys enjoyed watching along with that. Until next time, happy painting, everybody.